David Shistokis, thank you for joining us on the Illinois channel. And we want to be talking to you about a story that I think a lot of Americans have heard about, and also involves an individual here from Illinois. You're from Illinois, and you are representing Reverend Stephen Lee, who is one of 19 individuals who has been indicted by the Fulton County, Georgia prosecutor. She is alleging a RICO violation. A RICO violation is about a conspiracy to commit a crime. She is alleging that President Trump and others, 19 in total, had participated in a conspiracy to try to overturn the election in Georgia back in 2020, November of 2020, to turn Trump from Biden, or to turn Georgia, I should say, from a Biden victory to a Trump victory. That is what she is alleging. And for the purpose of our viewers, David is the attorney for Reverend Stephen Lee, one of the 19. And folks, this can be a complicated issue. We will try, David and I, to keep it relatively simple. And David, before we get into the specifics of your client, Reverend Lee, and by the way, before I say that, where does Reverend Lee live in Illinois? What part of the state is he from?
He lives in Kendall County, Terry, and he is pastor to a Lutheran church in Orland Park.
Okay, and you yourself live in the Orland Park area, is that right?
I live in Orland Park myself, yes, sir.
Okay. But this also is not an Illinois story, as we say. This is about something happening in Georgia because it involves President Trump, who obviously is running for president, and really involves the nation. And let's start off then with the big picture of the nation. Let me bring up, if I will. This is page 1, the top part of 2 pages. It doesn't all fit because, as we said, there are 19 names. But they start off on this indictment here with, as you can see on the left column, Donald Trump. And he is followed by Rudy Giuliani, who, of course, is President Trump's, one of his attorneys. And it alleges later in her indictment, the prosecutor's indictment, let's just, I'll summarize what she calls Act 1, which is the day after the November 2020 election, November 4. And she alleges that in a national speech, Trump declared victory falsely, she says, and that she's saying the speech was an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy she is alleging to overturn the election in Georgia. And then in Act 2, she references Rudy Giuliani, and she says here that Giuliani made false statements. And again, the telephone call that Giuliani made on the 15th of November was an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. So she continues to make this allegation of these 19 that they were all part of this vast conspiracy to overturn the election. And let me just kind of throw it to you from your standpoint, and I should say to our viewers, David is a constitutional expert. Aside from being an attorney representing his client, he had given many speeches and talks and discussions on understanding the Constitution. So he kind of he's a perfect guy, because I would argue, as a layman, that she is trying to criminalize speech by saying that Trump, the day after the election, already knew that he lost, when I would say Donald Trump, even to this day, would still assert that he actually won the election in Georgia and that it was stolen from him. And whether he is right or wrong, he has the right to voice his opinion of things. So with that in mind, David, let me hand it over to you. What can you tell us before we get into your client about your reaction to this overall indictment and what she is alleging as far as RICO violations?
Certainly. Just as a bit of background, Terry, there's a Georgia RICO law. The RICO law was basically designed originally, apparently, to get mob bosses and organized crime, street gangs, drug cartels. That's what RICO is designed to do. It's not designed to prosecute these kinds of matters. But nevertheless, and while that's also, she lists 161 overt acts, like the first two acts that you talked about regarding President Trump making a speech and Rudy Giuliani making a phone call. And she makes these allegations. Among the allegations, among the reasons that she indicted people were there were lawyers giving legal advice. There were other folks that were lobbying state legislatures. There were folks that were providing constitutional information to state legislatures about what their authority is under the Constitution. And there's clients and there's people like my client that was somehow indicted for for knocking on a couple of people's doors and making 2 phone calls, and somehow or other he was part of this vast conspiracy. And you mentioned at the top, Terry, that Ms. Willis is trying to prosecute people that were indicted for trying to overturn the election in Georgia. But actually, if you have the time to read the whole 98 pages in detail, she actually indicates that the conspiracy is not just to overturn the election in Georgia, but actually the presidential election across the country. Ms. Willis is seemingly trying to take over the role of the United States Congress by saying she has jurisdiction over the national aspects of the election for president of the United States, which is just absurd. It's just absurd. There is no allegation that they're trying to overturn Georgia by itself, but rather that they're trying to overturn the entire election. And, we have 5 rights in the First Amendment. You mentioned the freedom of speech part of the First Amendment, but there's actually 5 rights. You got your religion, speech, press, assembly, and then the right to petition the government for redress of grievances, and the and assembly, excuse me. And so, in any event, there are acts within this indictment among the 161 that she accuses people of violating, that run afoul of each and every of the 5 elements of the First Amendment. So I have no idea what she's thinking. She's assuming jurisdiction over the entire country out of this courthouse in Fulton County, Georgia. And in addition to that, she is saying that, no, you cannot contest an election because if you contest an election, then consequently you're doing something criminal. And that's the essence of the claim.
Yeah, I mean, so when she says that Trump spoke on a nationally televised address, she's saying that was a crime.
She's saying that's part and parcel of the crime too. And strangely
let's make this as simple as possible as we can. Okay. Does the President of the United States at the time, Donald Trump, not have the right, his own constitutional right, to make a statement about something he believes to be true? Does he not have that right?
Frankly, he has that right, but he also has a right to make a statement he believes to be false.
Right. And that was going to be my next point. He has the right under the Constitution to tell a bold-faced lie if he wishes to.
That's exactly right. And that's what the First Amendment's all about, is if you tell a lie, then somebody else has the First Amendment right to contest your lie and have debate about that in public. And so it's not, and so the fact that even if she was strangely correct when she said he falsely claimed, that doesn't matter. That he has the absolute right to falsely claim that for whatever reason. So his knowledge and whatnot, there's nothing illegal about that, and it can't be considered illegal. And again, we're going to get to Reverend Lee, but we have, like I said, there's nothing illegal about lawyers giving legal advice. When you showed that first page, the next guy after Mr. Giuliani was a fellow by the name of John Eastman. John Eastman is one of the more well-respected, well-known constitutional authorities.
Let me, if I might, David, just bring that up so people can see. And go ahead. And you see, ladies and gentlemen, the first column there on the left, after Rudy Giuliani is John Eastman, who is another attorney representing, as I believe Rudy Giuliani was also representing Donald Trump.
Sure. John Eastman is a well-respected, well-known constitutional authority and has been, in fact, included in this and indicted for essentially giving legal advice. Okay. And then the next guy on that list, he's Mark Meadows was in fact the chief of staff of the President of the United States, and he's indicted for giving advice to the President of the United States as the chief of staff. There's
Yeah,
another. The next
it's
guy that's
really,
on the list.
I mean, I find this shocking because to me, I'm no lawyer. The woman who the prosecutor is, and I'm no lawyer, but obviously the First Amendment protects what we were just talking about. It protects the ability to speak, whether it is true or not. And by the way, the irony here is, I believe the RICO law was first used by Rudy Giuliani when he was a prosecutor in New York to go after the mob. And the mob was a criminal enterprise. That's how RICO was supposed to be used. Or if we had some drug running operation, and people in different states were, engaged in drug running as a drug network or cartel, that would be a proper use of RICO. But to use the RICO law against public officials and their lawyers and their advisors, I just find this to be so obviously a miscarriage of justice, a misuse of the law. Can you explain this to me, how this woman, this prosecutor, even brought this to this point without someone else within the legal system saying, wait a minute, what are you doing? You can't indict people for making statements which they have every right to make.
Terry, I wish I could. Some things are so bizarre that it's very, very difficult to be able to try and understand why and how they happen. We are, from time to time, I'm in a courtroom. I've been in a courtroom recently on different kinds of election cases, and I've made certain arguments relative to certain legal standards about that you have to take the pleadings as true at this portion of the litigation, and things like those kinds of standards. And I literally have had lawyers on the other side jump up and go, "But Trump," and that's the sum and substance of their legal arguments. And you sit there and you go, "Huh?" You go, "What? Can I possibly even be in this courtroom with somebody that's doing that?" And yet it's happening. And unfortunately, you have judges that put up with it.
Why, can I ask, why didn't, I mean, I don't know the law like you know the law. Why didn't the Attorney General of Georgia insert himself and say, wait a minute, this is, you're putting forth indictments against people for things that aren't crimes?
Well, of course, the indictments are only 11 or 12 days old. The indictments were actually issued on the evening of August 14th, and so at this juncture, they're 2 weeks old today, I guess. So the actual legal action is only 2 weeks old, and so there have been Georgia legislators that are introducing motions in the Georgia legislature to, in fact, investigate and impeach Fani Willis. So there may very well be some movement to do that. Brian Kemp, the governor of Georgia, has the authority to do such a thing, to remove her from office. He has yet decided not to exercise such authority. And so legislators of the General Assembly of Georgia have taken action to move in that regard. And so that's being moved on that front. And actually, there's also an investigation that just started yesterday in the United States House of Representatives regarding Ms. Willis and her activities, and whether or not there's actually been collusion between her and the special prosecutor Jack Smith, who has running the grand juries in Washington, D.C. and Florida. And so there are people with authority starting to take some movement and some action relative to trying to answer the question that you're asking and see whether or not what Ms. Willis is doing is in fact legal.
We'll get in a minute to your client, Reverend Stephen Lee.
Yes.
But I also know that after the election, there were some hearings in a variety of states, in Wisconsin,
Yes.
where there were allegations of misconduct in the election in Pennsylvania. And I know you participated in the Pennsylvania State House, I think, hearing about, so you're familiar. Look, over the last number of years since the election, there are people in the United States who firmly believe the election was stolen, and there's a lot of people that think that that's a crazy idea, that Biden was fairly elected. And people can think what they want to think. But it's not true to say that there were no allegations of wrongdoing in elections, without getting
No,
too
it
deep in the
certainly-
weeds of Pennsylvania. But I mean, just to the extent that you were personally engaged and can speak to, what were just, if you can, briefly summarize just some of the sorts of allegations that you heard
Well,
about
there-
in Pennsylvania as an example.
It wasn't just that I heard about in Pennsylvania, Terry. I was there and I was an observer. And actually, I was scheduled to be a witness in a case in Pennsylvania. And I did testify before the Pennsylvania Senate. Certainly, among the things that was the most obvious is in Allegheny County in Pittsburgh, there was they did things in about a 40,000 square foot warehouse where the early ballots or the mail-in ballots that were coming in early were being processed. They kept all the observers, the losses are supposed to be observers from both parties, and they kept all the observers in a little corral that was far removed from where the processing was actually going on. But what we could see was that they would roll the ballots into the room where the processing was going on. Some of the processors were about 25 feet away. On the other hand, there was processors that were like 200 feet away. So we couldn't actually tell what they were doing. But for one thing, when they brought the ballots into the room to be processed, this I can tell you for a fact, they had already been opened. They did not bring in sealed ballots for the observers to watch the ballots to be unsealed, to watch the signatures to be verified, but rather they brought in ballots that had already, mail-in ballots that had already had the top seal opened. Because you can see that nobody's working to open the seals. They just pull the envelope and the ballots go. And it was 300,000 of them came in like that, Terry. That there's no provenance. There's no chain of custody.
Well,
there's no proof of what was in that envelope.
Because of COVID, we had these Zuckerberg boxes that were sitting
Yes.
out there, and just talk about chain of custody. We had, if people ever watched this documentary, 2,000 Mules, they had security cameras where they had people in the dead of night coming up on bicycles and putting in ballots into these boxes that Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook had invested $400 million and given it out to different election organizations so that people could, it made it easy to be stuffing the ballot box illegally, and that's certainly what it looked like in that documentary. And my point here is not to relitigate the issue of whether or not the election was stolen or not, but to go back to the charges in Georgia. It's not as if this is wholly without any examples, for her to assert that Trump knew that he had lost the election. There were plenty of reasons, valid reasons, as you just said, as the documentary 2,000 Mules and others allege in other states, where they were saying there were election improprieties. And I mean, that's what I would say as a objective layman. For her to be charging, the prosecutor in Fulton County, Georgia, for her to be saying this is a conspiracy, and that for Rudy Giuliani and Mark Meadows and Donald Trump, that they all had to be 100% sure that they had lost the election, but they were engaged in a conspiracy to overturn the election nationwide. That is what she is alleging, and it just seems
That's
like there
right.
is such ample evidence of doubt about various improprieties in various states, as we mentioned, not only in Georgia, where the voting was stopped for a while because allegedly of a broken pipe, which turned out not to exist because of what you just told us about Pennsylvania. And I had recorded at that time, and actually still have the video, of some of the hearings in Wisconsin where there were mentioned improprieties. So for the people who don't get into weeds like you and I kind of tend to do, because we follow this stuff, that's something people should know. Now, let me turn, if I might, and let you You have Representative Stephen Lee. Let me bring up for the people. This is his mugshot. He is not a Catholic priest. He is, I believe, a Lutheran minister. But what can you tell us about your client? Why is Stephen Lee from Illinois being indicted by the prosecutor down in Georgia?
Well, if you want my personal opinion, I really don't know why. I will tell you what she says she's doing, but I don't really understand it. She says that Reverend Lee went in Georgia, and he was in Georgia, and he knocked on the door of a neighbor of a woman by the name of Ruby Freeman. And the neighbor said, no, Ruby lives like next door down the street. And so he talked to the neighbor briefly, and then he left. And then he went over and he knocked on the door of Ruby Freeman. Ms. Freeman never answered the door, and Reverend Lee left. And he went and he was in his car momentarily, and shortly after he got in his car, a police officer came over and they spoke. He indicated that he wanted to talk to Ms. Freeman, but she didn't answer the door, and that he was going to, he was going to leave. And so that's those are two of the overt acts: knocking on the neighbor's door and knocking on Ms. Freeman's door are supposedly two of the acts that are involved in the overturning of the presidential election nationwide. Then, and you said the counts, there's 161 acts, as they refer to them. That was, but there are counts that charge crimes. And counts 20 and 21 regarding Reverend Lee indicate that he is supposedly soliciting false testimony from an election worker. And but of course, he never even talked to the election worker. And so counts 30 and 31, he was on the telephone with a couple other people. That's the allegation. And they had some discussions about Ms. Freeman. And then supposedly those two telephone calls that Reverend Lee was part of were also in an effort to overturn the election of the president of the United States nationally. That's what's so absurd about this, is that she is claiming to be apparently having jurisdiction over something that only the United States Congress has. I mean, that's insane.
Let me, if I might, because I just happened to pull this up. This is from page 17 of the indictment. Would you say? I think you said 98 pages, are there? And the key element here, which would impact your client, Reverend Lee, is the last sentence here. In furtherance of this scheme, the scheme to overturn the election, in furtherance of the scheme, members of the enterprise traveled from out of state to harass Freeman, who you were just speaking about, Ruby Freeman, who was one of the workers, I should say,
this is the short
when they
section
were
of the
counting
video the drug team has
ballots.
shared. It's not suitcases being
She
pulled
was
from under that table,
at this
but official
site.
sealed ballot containers.
So we have that in furtherance of the scheme, members of the enterprise traveled from out of state to harass Freeman, intimidate her, and solicit her to falsely confess to election crimes which she did not commit, according to the indictment. Now, I just want to make sure so the people can understand, how do we connect Reverend Lee from Illinois to what was going on in Georgia? Now, did your client go to Georgia? I mean, how did he get sucked into this?
Reverend Lee, brings in the context of perhaps Reverend Lee's history. Reverend Lee, before he got the call to go to the ministry, he actually had 17 years in law enforcement. He was a Mendocino County, California sheriff, and then deputy sheriff. And then after that, he spent a period of time with what was then called NIS and is now got fame on television as NCIS. He was an NCIS special agent at the time that he determined that it was appropriate to go to seminary. Then he went to the seminary, and since that time, he's had this unique combination of law enforcement history and experience and his calling into ministry. And dating back to Columbine, he responded as a chaplain to Columbine and counseled law enforcement survivors and victims of that deadly, deadly shooting that is burned into just about everybody's memory. And in fact, he worked in the library, and he assisted some of the forensic teams in terms of the bodies and collecting evidence, because he also had the law enforcement background besides his chaplaincy. But from that point, that was the first time he was involved in such a thing. But from that point on, the history goes on to being a chaplain to NYPD after 9/11.
But let me insert, how does this connect him to the Georgia thing? I mean, so he has an admirable background both in law enforcement and the ministry, but why was he plucked out of Illinois to be indicted by a Fulton County, Georgia prosecutor?
As people may or may not remember, there seemed to be a crisis for the United States of America going on in Georgia at that particular point in time.
And he went down to Georgia, just to be clear?
Yes. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. There's no denying that Reverend Lee went to Georgia, that he traveled to Georgia from Illinois on his own. Without, it bears saying at this moment, he doesn't know President Trump. He's never met President Trump. He's never met Mr. Giuliani. He's never met Mr. Eastman, Mr. Meadows. The list goes on and on. And none of those folks had anything to do with his presence in Georgia. His presence in Georgia had to do with the kind of guy he is in terms of his history, and trying to be involved in situations where America's in crisis and he thinks he can help. And so he thought perhaps
with his background in law enforcement, was he on his own just trying to make sense of some of this? I mean, what was his motivation? Was he kind of going back to, you might say, being a law enforcement officer in his own mind, because he's no longer a law enforcement officer, but trying to just ask some questions of some of the people? Did he ever talk? Because, as I've mentioned before, this comes up to where he's, I think, being part of named, he's not being named right here, but I think this is where he's being drawn in, where he's saying some members of the enterprise traveled from out of state. That would apply to then Reverend Lee going from Illinois to Georgia to harass Freeman and try to get her to say false confessions. Did he ever talk to Freeman directly?
No.
So
he never had a word, never had a phone call. He knocked on her door one time. She didn't answer. He left.
So he didn't know President Trump. He doesn't know Mark Meadows. He couldn't really have been conspiring with them if he never had conversations with them. I presume he would have to have had some sort of communications with them if this was a conspiracy. I said something before. We talked about RICO. It was actually, as I say, I think first used by Rudy Giuliani to go after the Mafia. That is a money-making enterprise. Selling drugs is a money-making enterprise. Does RICO have to engage in a money-making enterprise? She is using the term enterprise for people who were trying to challenge election results. Is that a fair use of the RICO law?
I would suggest to you that it's not. Yes, she in fact is trying to criminalize challenging elections. And if there's the least bit of success for this, if there's a conviction for anybody under this, America's societal organization has had part of its underpinnings taken away. Because certainly, we're to be governed by the consent of the governed. And of course, that means that people have to have confidence in the outcome of an election. And for people to have confidence in the outcome of an election, you have to be in a situation where you can effectively challenge it and be comfortable with the outcome of the challenge, or at least accept that you had every opportunity to present all the challenges that you wish to make. And so if there's any success of this, the ultimate result is when it comes to an election, citizens, defeated candidates, you're supposed to sit down and shut up and accept whatever the people who are in charge at that moment in time tell you. And so it's a very, very dangerous thing that she's doing. And the people that are cheering on this prosecution because they may not like President Trump have no idea of the danger they're putting their own civil rights in. Because sooner or later, that means that there's no free speech, there's no freedom of religion, there's no right to assemble, there's no right to petition the government for redress of grievances, there's no ability to lobby state legislators. Just about all the underpinnings of American society and organization are under attack in this indictment.
And again, I've said this before, but if this is going to be a conspiracy, it would seem to me she would have to prove that they absolutely knew that the election had been lost, when they clearly had reason to believe, for a variety of reasons we already talked about, that there could have been some votes not counted, other votes miscounted. We've seen this before. There have been any number of times over the course of American history that there have been elections where there have been close elections and recounts. And I believe, I think the vote difference in Georgia was something like 11,000 votes.
0.26%.
Yeah, I was going to say, given the number, I didn't know. Thanks for that. I didn't know the number, but 0.26%. It is not unheard of that there could have been votes that were miscounted or misplaced. We have had, again, other elections where they find ballots that were in a box that had not been counted. So, I mean, I just find this, again, as a layperson, to be rather bizarre. And again, the dangers of you just mentioned to all of our First Amendment rights, our civil rights, if we could have prosecutors, convicting people for making statements that are not part of a conspiracy, and number two, this whole idea that we can have local prosecutors deciding to indict a president of the United States, in this case a former president, but he's a leading candidate for the presidency in 2024. You want to talk about election interference?
It's the ultimate.
We're seeing this. This is obviously election interference, which again impacts everyone across the nation. You don't work for free. I mean, you might be fairly priced. I don't know. I've never needed to hire you, but I presume the Reverend Lee is not, being a reverend making big bucks, and he's going to have to pay you for incurring some costs. How much of a hardship is this just for someone to defend themselves when they are indicted?
Well, let's start from a bit of the beginning. Last Tuesday, I had a conference a week ago. I had a conference with the prosecutors in Georgia. The very first time we actually had the ability to speak with anybody. And it's also interesting. I've seen news reports when they said the attorneys for the various defendants were having negotiations on surrender conditions and bond conditions. They were having these negotiations with the prosecutors. There were no negotiations, Terry. I got on the phone. We have local counsel in Georgia, and he was present in person. And they went through the conditions of bond that they're proposing for Reverend Lee, none of which were unusual. It's, stay out of trouble, don't break any laws, don't harass people, show up for court when you're supposed to, those kinds of conditions. And those are all fine. We got to the end and they said, okay, the bond that they're proposing, the bail that they're proposing for Reverend Lee was $75,000, 10% to apply, in which case he would need $7,500 to get out of jail. And I told them at that point in time, I said, this man does not have $7,500. I said, he's a minister. He doesn't even own his home. And so he doesn't have any of those assets to do this. And I said, there's a high probability that unless we can negotiate this man is going to wind up in jail. They didn't care. They said, you guys can agree to this and consent to this situation regarding the bond, or we'll be issuing a no bond warrant for Reverend Lee. So essentially, they held a gun to my head, my co-counsel's head, and we ultimately agreed to it. And yet they published this as a consent bond agreement, and it's not. It's not. But so I wound up being able to that afternoon. I told Reverend Lee what transpired, and he started fully being prepared to go into custody. So, but fortunately, we had the good offices of the Illinois Family Institute volunteer to allow us to utilize their website and their ability to collect funds to start to build a defense fund for Reverend Lee.
I know we have a graphic here, just in case anyone watching this from any location, if they wanted to contribute to help offset the cost of defending Lee. I've looked at, we've seen Over the last 5 years or so since President Trump, look at the money President Trump had to spend to defend himself against the false allegations of stealing the election, working with Putin. The government spent $40 million investigating under Robert Mueller. We had General Flynn, who was the first national security advisor to President Trump. He was targeted by the FBI. He had to defend himself. This is a four-star general who served in combat for the United States his whole career, and here he was bankrupted. I think he lost his home just trying to spend money. Other members of the Trump administration, same thing, had to basically go broke after a whole career of working in public service. This weaponization of the law seems to me to be just something that is relatively new and frankly,
it's new
quite frightening to all of our civil rights and rights to be able to speak out. We might say we have the freedom to speak, but then if you're going to be targeted and forced into bankruptcy after an entire career of working and saving and investing, what kind of fairness is that?
Well, you don't. That takes your freedom away. That takes your freedom away. And of course, the Illinois Family Institute had just started the fundraising about on Monday, or they made available that on that Monday. And by Thursday night, the night before we were to go to Georgia, the contributions amounted to about $4,000 in a very short period, and we hadn't had the opportunity even to get the word out much. And so when Reverend Lee went to bed on Thursday night, August 24th, he fully well expected the next day to be surrendering and going into custody in the Fulton County Jail, which, by the way, is under federal investigation for abusing its prisoners, for unsafe conditions, and for a variety of other things in terms of the poorly run aspects of that jail. He fully well expected to be going into custody on that Friday afternoon. And I did a podcast talking about these issues with Silk of Diamond and Silk. Of course, her companion Diamond passed away last year, but Silk is still doing her own podcast. And we started that about 9 o'clock Sunday night, and by about 9:45, I had explained all this situation, and that Reverend Lee was preparing to go into jail on Friday, and that he consequently, obviously, would not be in church on Sunday, where he was scheduled to preach. And after we got through that, Silk says, Reverend Lee needs to be in church on Sunday. And you're short what? $3,500? I said, yes, ma'am. She said, I'm going to make that good. I'm going to get you the $3,500 to get Reverend Lee out of jail, to keep Reverend Lee from going into jail. And within the next couple hours, she contacted us, and we made arrangements, and she got her $3,500 into the fund. And then, of course, by that time, it was almost midnight, and the Reverend was asleep. He and I were heading to Midway to get on a plane at about 5 o'clock in the morning. So I didn't call him during the middle of the night. I didn't want to wake him up. So when he woke up in the morning on Friday, he fully well found he was going to jail. He had prepared for me a list of what his medications were, kind of other kinds of things, and the ability to have his Bible while he was in custody, and other issues like that. He was fully well prepared and had instructions for me about what to seek in that regard. One of the things was certainly to be, if they were going to take him into custody, have him in protective custody, because he's a former law enforcement officer. And so these were all things that were weighing heavily on his mind. But on the way to the airport, I was on my way. He was on his way. His daughter was driving him. I called him and told him what happened with Silk late the night before. And of course, we're on speakerphone in their car, and I could just hear his daughter scream with joy that her dad was not going to be locked up that afternoon, that he was going to be able to come home. I suggest, I don't know, it felt like there was divine intervention the way that happened, Terry. It just felt amazing. And so he was going to be locked up. And there were two things about Silk's Silk conversation. One, she asked, and this is how she put it. She says, well, when Reverend Lee is found not guilty, he's going to get the money back, right? I said, yes, ma'am. He said, well, when he gets that money back, you tell him that $3,500 is now donated to his church. And just, I have goose pimples now about that moment. And so we're indebted to her. We're indebted to the Illinois Family Institute. We're indebted to all the people that chipped in 50, 75, 25 bucks to get to the $4,000. It's been growing at the moment. But, when you mentioned about me, that's at the moment secondary. He and I went to Georgia on Friday. And because, of course, you have to be there when the court says you have to be there. It's not like you can plan your trip in advance and get the best airline tickets. He and I went to Georgia. We were there for the day. Round trip tickets for the two of us, $1,200. Okay, $1,200 for round trip tickets to Georgia. And I mean, that's just one example of the kind of things he's looking at going forward. And so we're certainly going to do our best to get the word out and help raise some money on that. Somebody else said when I was doing an interview, they said, "Well, raising money is called a legal defense fund." He said, "You're going to get paid." He said to me, I said, "No, the first thing we're going to do is bail out Reverend Lee. The first thing." So I hope we're going to see some good things, but at the moment, no, Terry, I haven't seen a dime.
Let me, before we close, we've already gone longer than I thought, but two things. One, what is the timeline at this point? So she's indicted, your client's out on bail, but how long is this going to be hanging over him? How much, is this, do we have any trial date? Do we know what's the next step on this?
There's not a trial date in our case at the moment. There's other litigation going on. Of course, Mr. Meadows has filed motions in federal court asking that his case and possibly the rest of them be removed from Georgia state court to federal court based on his status as a federal official. On the other hand, there's two other folks. That is Sidney Powell, the attorney, and Jim Cheeseborough, another attorney, that have filed what they call speedy trial motions, and they actually, have set trial dates for them for October 23rd. So somewhere in between, it is possible that this may drag on past the time when we have a new president, because you have 19 defendants, probably a minimum of 38 lawyers, all with
are they going to be all tried one by one, or is there going to be a group trial?
The stated goal of the prosecutor is to have a group trial, is to try everybody all at one time. That's her stated goal.
Now,
but it's already not going to happen because these other people aren't going to be ready October 23rd, and the first two have to be tried before November 1st.
Has anything begun? Is there any process underway to have her removed? I know we kind of touched on this earlier, but just to have her removed, or to petition the Attorney General or the Governor of Georgia to intercede and say, look, if we normally don't intercede, but when you have a prosecutor indicting people for violating, for speaking in violation of the Constitution, is there any sort of appeal process just on a procedural matter to where you could say, no, we're gonna pull the plug on this because she's violating the law by bringing these indictments?
I've had an opportunity to speak with some of the other counsel and myself. One of them, certainly your original suggestion, has to do with some politics in Georgia, and there's things going on with the Georgia legislature where there's certain members that are acting to try and remove her from office. Legally, inside the case, there have been known public leaks from the grand jury. And because of what's supposed to be the sanctity of the grand jury, there are potential motions to, in fact, dismiss certain aspects of the case for misconduct during the course of the grand jury. The House of Representatives, Jim Jordan, has just opened an investigation relative to collusion between Jack Smith, the special counsel, and Fannie Willis. There's some reason to believe, or at least Congressman Jordan indicates that there's some reason to believe that they've been exchanging information in a fashion that they're not allowed to. Because, of course, if Smith is sharing with Willis grand jury information from from the Washington federal grand jury. He's broken the sanctity of the Washington federal grand jury. She's now obtained evidence illegally, and so there's a lot of litigation to go on long before anybody ever starts to question or select juror number one in any of these cases.
In fact, a number of legal shenanigans are going on. I say this as a layman, but Jack Smith, isn't he bringing charges in D.C., using a grand jury in D.C. for the document case, which happened in Mar-a-Lago, which I have never heard of, having a grand jury in an entirely different state or political region? I mean, have you ever heard of that happening before?
There are specific venue clauses within the Constitution itself relative to bringing charges and an investigation within the district in which the crime is alleged to have been committed. And so it appears as though they've utilized a grand jury in Washington, D.C. to lay the groundwork for the charges that are being utilized that are being pursued in Florida. And so that's going to be litigated. There's a fair probability, and I think that maybe very well although recently they set a March 4th trial date for the Washington, D.C. case, which is, of course, the day before Super Tuesday. Go figure. The day before Super Tuesday, which is all the presidential primaries, about 7 or 8 states at one time. And so that's the day the trial is supposed to start.
You know what's interesting? Go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, you finished. No, I'm fine.
Well, I was going to say, what's interesting, I've heard reports that since President Trump has been indicted by her in Georgia, he's raised $7 million in donations.
That was in one day.
In one day, yeah. I mean, it might be more by now.
The single biggest day. And apparently the best-selling merchandise on his site right now has his mugshot. The best-selling merchandise includes T-shirts and coffee cups and whatnot. I don't know. Reverend Lee's mugshot is pretty good too. Maybe we should go in the Reverend Lee mugshot business.
Here's his mugshot there. Bring it up again.
I was surprised. I had told him that I expected before they published it they would crop the collar, but they didn't. And they dished him with his collar, which he's a fully ordained active minister and fully, has the authority and the ability to wear such a thing. So I was surprised. But so maybe we should do some Reverend Lee mugshot T-shirts. The
one last thing I was going to say, you've done a number of media availabilities. I think you were on. Am I right that you were on some radio stations where callers could call in?
Yes.
And the reason I ask that is, what response are you getting in talking about just what you and I have been talking about? I don't have that facility to take viewers' calls. Yeah. And we're taping this on, what is today, August the 28th or 9th, I forget. But what kind of response are you getting from the public? How are they reacting to your story?
The public response is all in favor of Reverend Lee. And actually, you and I spent more time today talking about the misconduct of the district attorney than I have been on any other in any other interview. We've spent more time talking about Reverend Lee and his history of service and how unfair and almost obscene to prosecute this good and decent man on really next to nothing. And we don't even have to say it. But of course, when we're on some of these shows that are live streamed on Facebook and YouTube, beyond everything else, we also tend to see you have comments that are running down that are while the show is going on, and the comments from the public are, "My goodness, this woman is evil." I mean, I never have to say that she's evil. They just find out that she's evil. We're praying for you, Reverend Lee. We're gonna be there. And people are finally starting to get that it's not just Reverend Lee though that's under attack or President Trump. It doesn't matter whether you like Donald Trump or not. It doesn't matter. What's at issue here is actually the entire structure and organization of the American Republic. If this woman can convict people for exercising free speech, for lawyers for giving legal advice, for lobbying your state legislature, for knocking on a door as a minister, which attacks, of course, freedom of religion, by the way. Freedom of religion, you add that to free speech and all these other issues. American society you stick a fork in it. If If they can convict people on these charges, we have no Bill of Rights anymore. We have no Constitution, and that's what's at stake here. And that's why Reverend Lee and Donald Trump, under the charges, you don't have to vote for him, you don't have to like him, but these charges against Donald Trump endanger every citizen of the United States of America.
David Shtokis, let's leave it there, but we appreciate you for joining us. And as this goes along, if there's other reasons to give us an update, we'll look forward to doing another interview with you at that time. In the meantime, one last time, I'll bring it up. If people wanted to help out financially with the Reverend Lee's finances, you can go to this website, illinoisfamily.org/contribute. That money all goes to the defense of Reverend Lee. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. Thank you so much for having me, Terry.
Thank you so much.